The last surviving document from Norse Greenland is a wedding certificate. It records the marriage of Sigrid Bjornsdottir to Thorstein Olafsson in the small stone church at Hvalsey on the southwestern coast in September of 1408. The ceremony was attended by the bishop and the local farmers. Then the document ends. Within 60 years, there were no Norsemen left in Greenland. We do not know exactly why. In the same waters at the same time, a different people were arriving from the north and beginning to thrive. The Thule, ancestors of the modern Inuit, had crossed from Alaska across the top of Canada and reached Greenland's western coast around 1200. They lived along the same fjords as the Norse, hunted the same animals, fished the same waters. When the Norse vanished, the Thule remained. They are still there. The traditional story of why the Norse failed and the Inuit succeeded comes from Jared Diamond's 2005 book Collapse. Diamond argued that the Norse refused to adapt. They tried to live as European farmers in the Arctic, keeping cows and sheep, building stone churches, trading walrus ivory to Europe, when the climate they had arrived in was warmer than the climate that came later. When the Little Ice Age began in the early 14th century, their farms failed, and they starved rather than learn from the people next door. It is a clean morality tale. Two cultures, same environment, one that adapted and one that refused. It has been quoted in policy debates about climate adaptation for 20 years. It is also wrong, or at least it is much more wrong than it is right. The Norse arrived in Greenland with Eric the Red around 985 AD. They settled two main areas, the eastern settlement near modern Qaqortoq and the smaller western settlement further north near modern Nuuk. At their peak around 1300, there were perhaps 3,000 Norse Greenlanders in around 400 farms. They built churches. They paid tithes to the bishop in Rome, paid in walrus ivory and walrus rope, since they had no coined silver. The richest farms had cattle and stone byres. The poorest had only sheep and goats. What changed everything was not primarily the Little Ice Age. It was the collapse of a global commodity market. For 3 centuries, walrus ivory had been the Greenland Norse export crop. European craftsmen used it for chess pieces, religious carvings, and luxury items. The Norse hunted walrus along the western Greenland coast and shipped the tusks to Bergen, in Norway. The economy of every Greenlandic farm depended directly or indirectly on this trade. Then, in the late 13th century, 2 things happened. First, the Black Death arrived in Europe and killed half the customer base. Second, elephant ivory began arriving from Africa via the new Portuguese sea routes, and it was better, cheaper, and easier to source. The walrus market collapsed. The Greenland Norse were left with a population that had been built over generations around the assumption that walrus tusks could be exchanged for everything they could not make themselves: iron, timber, salt, grain in bad years. When the trade dried up, they had no replacement. Recent isotope studies of Norse skeletons from Greenland show what happened next. Carbon isotopes can tell archaeologists what proportion of a person's diet came from land animals versus sea animals. The earliest Norse Greenlanders ate mostly farm food: beef, mutton, milk. By 1400, the same farm's inhabitants were eating predominantly seal, fish, and seabirds. They were eating more like the Inuit than like the European farmers their grandparents had been. They had adapted. The adaptation was not enough. The reason it was not enough lies in a difference of technology that has nothing to do with stubbornness. The Inuit had 2 crucial innovations the Norse did not: the toggling harpoon and the kayak. The toggling harpoon, with a barbed head that turns sideways inside the wound, made it possible to hunt large sea mammals like ringed seals at the breathing hole, a technique that gave the Inuit reliable winter food when the fjords froze over. The kayak gave them rapid mobility on open water. The Norse hunted from heavy clinker-built boats that needed open shoreline to launch and could not navigate sea ice safely. When the climate cooled and the sea ice extended further south for longer each year, the Norse hunting techniques became less and less viable. The Inuit techniques remained effective. There is some evidence the two peoples met. Norse sagas mention skraelings, their word for the indigenous peoples, and a 1379 chronicle records a skirmish in which Inuit hunters killed 18 Norse and took 2 captives. There is no evidence that the Norse adopted Inuit technology, or that they wanted to. Cultural identity in late medieval Christian Europe was tied to specific tools and practices. To hunt with a toggling harpoon from a kayak was to a Norse Greenlander to stop being Norse. The collapse, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no single famine, no battle, no plague. The western settlement was abandoned around 1360. The eastern settlement persisted longer. The wedding at Hvalsey is the last record. After that, ships from Europe stopped coming. The Black Death had wrecked the maritime economy. The climate had made the route harder, and the goods had stopped being valuable. Whoever was left in Greenland in the 1450s simply died, generation by generation, with the population finally too small to reproduce itself. By 1500, when the first European ships returned, they found empty settlements with church bells still in the towers. What the new isotope evidence and recent excavations show is a more complex picture than diamonds. The Norse did adapt, but to a hunting and gathering economy on the margins of a continent, with technologies designed for European waters. They did not refuse to learn. They learned what they could, slowly, generation by generation, but never enough. And meanwhile, their connection to the European economy collapsed, and they had no way to replace what that connection had given them. The Inuit, by contrast, were not connected to a global market that could fail them. They had what they needed in their immediate environment, harvested with the right tools, sustained for centuries. When the climate shifted, they adjusted their range and their hunting calendar. They did not need ships from Norway. What the Norse Greenland story tells us, perhaps, is not that one culture was wiser than another. It is that two ways of living can occupy the same space for centuries, and only one will be sustainable when conditions change. The Norse colony was a frontier outpost of a continent-spanning economy. When the economy retreated, the outpost was abandoned. The Inuit were not an outpost. They were home. They are still there,